Welcome to Understanding Bokeh in Photography. Bokeh is the word for that soft, out-of-focus background blur that you see in photography. It's a generally popular effect that's achieved when shooting with a low f number, which is a wide aperture, which creates a shallow depth of field. A shallow depth of field means that only a narrow section of the image is in focus. In this video, I'm going to talk about why bokeh is desirable, how to achieve bokeh, and then I'm going to talk about some of my favorite bokeh techniques. Along the way, I'll share a lot of image examples to give you an idea of what we're talking about. I will get a little technical, but I'll focus more on the practical application of the depth of field techniques that create bokeh. I'm also going to say bokeh a lot, so if you have an issue with how I pronounce it, just stop watching now and go read the blog post instead. I'll link that below. I'm Brenda Bergering, giving you practical photography advice to complement Mark's gear reviews from our real-world experience as a husband and wife photo-video team. Hit subscribe, it helps us out. So let's start with why bokeh is desirable. Bokeh, spelled B-O-K-E-H, comes from a Japanese word that means blur, haze, or blur quality. One of the main reasons we love bokeh is that it helps your subject pop and look more crisp relative to the background. You see it a lot in macro photography, like close-ups of birds, flowers, or other details in nature because of how close you are to your subject. The shallow depth of field created by macro lenses helps a tiny flower pop crisply from the background. It's also super popular for portraits, whether that's newborns or headshots. It helps your subject be the focus of the image. Our eyes are then drawn to the sharpest part of the image, so a headshot focused on someone's eyes helps us connect with them. Many times we also use bokeh to blur an undesirable background so that the subject is sharp, but the clutter in the background disappears. If you look at some images with beautiful bokeh, you'll see how it can be buttery or silky. Different people have different words to describe the bokeh effect that they appreciate. We'll talk about undesirable bokeh as well in the next section after we understand it a little better. And when iPhone introduced portrait mode, the bokeh-like effect makes it possible to take iPhone images with a shallow depth of field. It's digitally created and therefore not as pleasing in my opinion, but a portrait on portrait mode is more flattering than just the standard iPhone lens. Lightroom also has a new feature that digitally creates bokeh in post-production. I'll talk about both of those in a later section. Let's move on to how to achieve bokeh. There's going to be some jargon in here, so I'll try to explain everything without over-explaining what we're talking about. We're going to talk about 5 contributing factors to bokeh: sensor size, aperture, distance, lens quality, focal length, and artificial bokeh. First up, sensor size. The first factor in bokeh will be your sensor size. The larger the sensor, the shallower the depth of field, which creates more bokeh blur because more of the scene is outside of the focus range. Most modern cameras are going to be either APS-C, which is 23 by 15 millimeters, or full frame, which is 36 by 24 millimeters. The smaller sensors might be less expensive, but will limit your ability to achieve bokeh. One way to combat this is to talk about other factors, such as distance. So let's go to factor 2, distance. One way to achieve bokeh is to decrease the distance between you and your subject while increasing the distance between your subject and the background. Get close to your subject. If you get close to a subject but achieve a large distance between your subject and the background, you can achieve bokeh with smaller sensors and smaller apertures, which are the larger f-stop numbers. We'll talk about aperture next, but this is great if you don't have a full frame camera with a wide maximum aperture lens, but still want bokeh. You can achieve it with an f4 lens instead of an f2 lens if you consider the distancing. You can even achieve it on the small sensor of your phone camera by getting close. This works because of the depth of field. A shallow depth of field will result in more bokeh because there's less in focus than in a wide depth of field, which will have deep focus and more of the image sharp. Therefore, the closer you are to your subject, the further away the background is, making it more likely to be outside of the depth of field of your setup, which will cause it to be out of focus, achieving that bokeh blur. Up next, number 3. Aperture. If you want to achieve bokeh, you generally need what we call a fast lens. A fast lens is a lens that has a wide maximum aperture, which is the smallest f number for the lens. A wide maximum aperture is something like f2.8 or even lower f-stop numbers like f1.8 or f1.4. The lower the f-stop number, the wider the aperture. Often the best lenses for bokeh are fast prime lenses because prime lenses with wide maximum apertures are generally more common and affordable than fast zoom lenses. Wide aperture is related to shallow depth of field. And as we've already learned, with a shallow depth of field, everything outside of that focus range will be blurry. Which brings us to number 4, lens quality. Now, the lens choice can have an impact on the pleasing quality of the bokeh. The lens determines how the resulting bokeh looks in terms of shape and size, as the shape and size of the aperture will dictate the shape of the bokeh. The more blades the aperture has, the more round and smooth the bokeh orbs will look because the aperture shape is more round and smooth. Some lens designs blur an image in a less pleasing way because it's distracting, so you might hear someone talk about bad bokeh. Instead of circular orbs of light, they'll be pentagonal or oblong or irregular. You'll notice it more in city lights or in the highlights of high contrast images because the orbs are inconsistent and fake looking. Often it'll be worse towards the edges of the images. This all feels a little subjective to me personally, so it's a little difficult to quantify what bad and good is, but I'm sure there's people out there that are bokeh connoisseurs that would balk at my choice in wine as well. I also know that when Mark reviews lenses, he always talks about image quality. So maybe the lenses he's chosen for our kit is why I don't really know that much about bad bokeh. I think it's probably more of an issue with vintage lenses as well. Anyway, that's not really the purpose of this video, but let me know in the comments if you want Mark to get more technical on lens design in a future video. But to ease your mind, most modern lenses, the bokeh looks great. So let's go on to number 5, focal length. The longer the focal length, the more pronounced the bokeh will be because the long focal lengths create a shallower depth of field. Wide lens, wide depth of field. Long lens, shallow depth of field. So if you use a long lens and stand close to your subject with a large distance from your subject to the background, the bokeh will be the most pronounced. You might want to check out Mark's video on the Samyang 135. He calls that lens the Bokeh King, so it's a great lens for bokeh. Despite the fact that I don't have much more to say about focal length, it's one of the more important factors to bokeh. It's why people love shooting portraits with an 85mm prime lens. Lastly, number 6, artificial bokeh. I mentioned briefly portrait mode on our phone cameras. I think it's worth mentioning since AI is slowly taking over our work. With iPhones or other phone cameras with super small sensors, they're using a depth map of the images to determine what to blur for bokeh. LiDAR, or light detection, uses lasers to map the depth. And there's a Lightroom lens blur tool that runs an analysis and selects the subject for you and then applies bokeh to the background. It's pretty crazy. You can change the bokeh shape from modern to bubble to vintage to ring or cat eye. You can also change the focus range and apply your bokeh based on Lightroom's depth map. This is pretty cool. If you shot something with a 50mm lens because that's what you had, but you wish you had your 85, you could artificially achieve bokeh in that image. It also seems awesome for graphic designers who want to blur more of an image in order to overlay text. It's definitely worth exploring the implications of this. So let me know if you want a video on Lightroom's lens blur tool in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. Real quick, let's summarize these 5 factors that we talked about that influence bokeh. Sensor size, get a big sensor. Aperture, use a fast lens like f1.4. Distance, get close to your subject so the background is far. Lens quality, the higher quality lens will equal more pleasing bokeh. Focal length, longer focal lengths will create more bokeh. And lastly, artificial bokeh, because if all else fails, we use technology. Now, when I'm not making a video about bokeh, I'll often use the terms shallow depth of field and bokeh interchangeably, even though they're not technically the same thing. Or I'll commonly say something like soft focus. Or I'll talk about my fast lens or my low aperture lens. I personally tend to save the word wide for describing my focal length and not my aperture. The lens is fast or low aperture or low f-stop. So you might hear people talk about all these things in different ways, but what's important is that you can achieve what you want to when you want it. Don't let the jargon stop you from the creativity. Now let's talk about bokeh techniques. We talked about how we use bokeh to help your subject pop and look more crisp. And we talked about using bokeh to blur an undesirable background. Let me share some more of my favorite uses of bokeh. One of my favorite bokeh techniques might be a little cliche, but I still love it, and that's photographing twinkle lights, market lights, or even Christmas lights. Just adds more interest to the background. I also really love a good foreground blur that I can achieve when shooting through flowers or trees. This allows me to create more depth or framing to an image. I love this for landscape portraits or environmental portraits, where I'm using nature to compose my image and flatter my subject. For weddings, bokeh is really nice in the getting ready room, where the room is cluttered and my goal is to make a bride feel beautiful. Brides spend hours getting ready and perfected, so a super shallow depth of field on lips or eyelashes can be really nice. Same for wedding rings or other details that you want to highlight in detail while showing something blurry in the background for context. One last note is that sometimes we shoot everything with a low aperture because that's easy from an exposure settings perspective. Don't go so crazy with bokeh and get so attached that you forget sometimes it's nice to have deep focus. That way the mountains behind your subject can be sharp and dramatic. Just because you bought that f1.2 lens doesn't mean you have to shoot it on f1.2 forever. I hope all this helps and maybe even inspires you to head out and shoot blurry photos intentionally. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.